The first thing I remember that night is the sound of crystal glasses clinking. Laughter, sharp and practiced, filled the dining room of our house. I was 15, seated at the long mahogany table that seemed to stretch forever, dwarfed by the polished portraits of ancestors my father liked to remind us had built empires. But it wasn't the grandeur of the night that carved itself into my memory. It was the sting of mashed potatoes shoved across my face, the heat of humiliation rushing to my ears, and the silence that followed, the kind of silence that makes you realize power doesn't just corrupt, it decays. And sitting at that table were the men who claimed power as casually as they lifted their forks. My father's friends. Politicians. CEOs. Judges. Men who had built careers on commanding rooms with their voices. But that night, they watched my father break, and none of them stopped it. The family performance. My father, Victor Calder, believed in performance. Dinners weren't dinners, they were stages where he performed dominance, charisma, and charm. My mother played her role, smiling just enough to avoid his wrath later, while my younger brother fidgeted nervously, always waiting for the storm to erupt. But this night was different. This night, Victor had invited his most influential allies to our home, determined to show them he was still in control. Rumors swirled that a scandal was about to erupt around him, financial improprieties, whispered betrayals, the type of secrets that made powerful men sweat behind closed doors. I was just the child at the edge of the table, the one no one expected to speak. But that invisibility often made me the most dangerous observer. The incident. It started with something small. My father asked me to pass the butter. His tone carried the sharp edge of warning. I reached for it, but my hand shook. I dropped the silver butter knife, and it clattered loudly on the china. The table froze. My father's jaw tightened. "Clumsy," he hissed. The guests chuckled politely, pretending it was nothing. But I saw the flare in his eyes. I knew the script. He would not let this go. "Look at you," he said louder, his voice cutting through the laughter. "Even something as simple as passing butter, and you embarrass me." I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to vanish, to sink into the chair. But before I could even form a response, he grabbed the back of my head and slammed my face into the plate before me. Mashed potatoes smeared across my skin, the heat of gravy burning at my cheek. The guests gasped, but no one stood. Their eyes darted nervously, like witnesses to a crime they didn't dare acknowledge. And then, the unexpected happened, my father's hands trembled. The cracks in power. Victor Calder was a man known for control, of his company, of his allies, of his family. But as I sat there, humiliated, I lifted my gaze to him, expecting the familiar cold fury. Instead, I saw fear. Not fear of me. Fear of them, his friends. Because they weren't laughing. They weren't excusing him. They were staring at him like he was no longer the man they had followed. His mask had slipped, and in its place was something fragile. The silence shattered when one of the men, Senator Harland, cleared his throat. "Victor," he said evenly, "perhaps you should, regain yourself. Regain yourself." As though my father had spilled wine on the tablecloth instead of shoving his child's face into food. But the damage was done. They had seen him break character. Internal conflict. That night, I lay awake replaying the scene in my mind. I should have felt only shame. But beneath the shame was something else, something dangerous. Satisfaction. For the first time, I had seen my father's armor crack. For the first time, I realized that he wasn't invincible. And yet, guilt gnawed at me. Because I hadn't fought back. Because my mother hadn't spoken. Because my brother had hidden under the table of silence. But most of all, because those men who could have stopped him, men who wielded enough power to change laws, economies, lives, chose to do nothing. They watched, measured him, and decided he was weaker than they thought. I began to wonder, What kind of power do you hold when the people who built you are waiting for you to fall? The spiral. In the days that followed, my father's behavior shifted. He was still cruel, still volatile, but underneath was an edge of desperation. He drank more. He snapped at the smallest things. He shouted on phone calls late into the night. Rumors of his scandal grew louder. News outlets began circling, whispering of corruption in contracts, of money disappearing where it shouldn't. One evening, I overheard my father in his office, his voice cracked with rage. "You think you can cut me off? After everything I've done for you?" The realization hit me, his powerful friends had turned. They had seen weakness at that dinner table, and they no longer trusted him to keep the empire afloat. It wasn't the scandal that was going to destroy him. It was the fact that, in front of them all, he had revealed he was not in control. The twist. Weeks later, another dinner was called. This time, the table was smaller, quieter. Only 2 of his allies attended. The others had declined. But my father insisted on the performance. He poured wine. He gave speeches. He tried to wear the mask again. And then he turned to me. "Tell them," he commanded. "Tell them what a strong man your father is. Tell them I keep this family in line." The guests shifted uncomfortably. I felt their eyes on me. My heart pounded. For years, silence had been my survival. But now, I understood something: silence had also been his power. So I spoke. I told them about the night he shoved my face into food. I described the humiliation, the fear, the way he had crumbled. My father's face drained of color. "Enough," he snapped. But I kept going. And for the first time, the guests didn't look away. The collapse. That dinner was the true end of my father's reign. The scandal broke soon after, but his allies didn't lift a finger to save him. They had already seen the truth: Victor Calder was not a man in control, but a man unraveling. At home, his rage became pitiful rather than terrifying. He shouted into empty rooms. He tried to intimidate us, but the power was gone from his voice. Even my mother began to push back, her silence cracking into sharp words. One evening, I watched him sitting in the study, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. The man who had once terrified me looked small, almost childlike. And I realized, the thing he had feared most wasn't losing his empire. It was being seen as weak. Conclusion. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed silent that night. If I had continued playing my role. Would my father still hold court among powerful men? Would he still command our household with fear? But the truth is, he destroyed himself. That violent moment at the dinner table wasn't just abuse, it was confession. It was the unmasking of a man who built his life on dominance, only to reveal he was held together by the fragile glue of other people's belief in him. My face healed. The shame faded. But what remains is the image of my father at that table, his hand on my head, his friends watching not in admiration, but in judgment. And sometimes, late at night, I ask myself a question that lingers like an echo. When powerful men crumble, is it because of what they do to others, or because, at last, others finally see them for who they are?